Hey writers, these 7 South American authors have some excellent advice for you today. Advice that you haven't heard before, and advice that's going to help you write your novel. Let's get right into it with the first piece of advice. Number 1, more fantastical equals more grounded. Now this advice comes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who is a very famous author from Colombia. I mean, come on, I could not make this video without mentioning him. This is the guy who is the father of magical realism. Now what he teaches us is when you have some sort of fantastical events in your story, you always have to ground those or root those with a lot of everyday details about the world. It's directly proportional. The more fantastical your story is, the more details you have to come up with to make the reader believe in those fantastical events. And for an example of this in action, let's look at his short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. This is the very first paragraph of the story, and he gives us all these concrete details to prepare us for the end of the paragraph. He talks about the rain, he talks about the crabs, he talks about his kid with a fever and how there's a stench inside the house. He talks about the color of the sea and the sky and the smell of rotten shellfish. Only after all those very concrete details does he finally get to the end of the paragraph and reveal that there is an old man with wings. All those details coax you as a reader into imagining this universe so that when he gets to the fantastical component, you're like, okay, I buy it. This is a great quote from Marquez. He said, "A novelist can do anything he wants as long as he makes people believe in it." A little reminder here to subscribe to Bookfox Academy if you haven't already. I just want to highlight a course called Master Your Writing Habits, where I talk about stuff like the triple reward system and fighting your writing kryptonite. Everybody who takes this course says they end up writing 3 times as much as they did previously. So I'd highly recommend that you check it out. The second piece of advice that we get from South American writers is number 2, how to prep the reader for a calamity. There is an author called Roberto Bolaño, and he is Chilean. He wrote a book called 2666, which is widely considered to be one of the best books, if not the best book of the 21st century. Now, this book is separated into 5 parts, and in the 4th part, there is a huge calamity where all these women are getting killed near the border of Mexico and the US. I mean, woman after woman after woman. He goes into gruesome detail of all the murders that are happening. So the question is, if you have an event like that later on in your novel, what do you do in the earlier parts of your novel to prepare the reader for it? Now, the first point that Bolaño teaches us, I think you might be able to guess, but I don't think you'll be able to guess the second one. The first thing he teaches us is simply foreshadowing. There are all these events in the first 3 sections of the novel where we see a woman getting abused by her husband or hear a story of women getting abused in some way. So that kind of foreshadowing prepares the reader for that 4th section of the book where, things get messy. But the second thing that Bolaño teaches us, which I think is pure genius, is that we need something to offset all of that violence against women in part 4 of the books. He creates really strong feminine characters in the first 3 sections of the book. What that does is it helps the book not to devolve into this sort of torture fest against women, as long as he has main leads who are very strong and who are very active. So in your own writing, think about the huge calamities that you have at the end of your book, and then figure out, how can I prepare the reader for that in the beginning of my book? The third very helpful tip that we can learn from South American writers is something called archival narration. And this tip comes from Isabel Allende, who is Chilean, and she's probably best known for her novel, The House of the Spirits. In The House of the Spirits, there is a narrator who constructs her family history using all of these old letters and old manuscripts. And the novel becomes very layered because it's not just this narrator speaking, it's also all these voices from the past embodied in notes and letters and stuff. This is often a really good technique to use when you're in a sticky place in terms of point of view. And by a sticky place, I mean you have a narrator and you're telling the story from their point of view, but there's something they don't know that the reader needs to know. How do you communicate that? So a great thing to do is to throw in a letter or a police report or a newspaper article in order to communicate the things that your narrator can't know. And obviously this isn't a technique that South American authors came up with. I just think Isabel Allende is a great example of it. it, but you also see stuff like Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's using doctor notes and diaries and news clippings and ship logs. Or if you want to be a little more modern, look at Sally Rooney. In Beautiful World, Where Are You? She has a lot of emails and a lot of text messages. She's a millennial, so of course she's going to incorporate that into her novel. Or look at Jennifer Egan, A Visit from the Goon Squad, where she uses a PowerPoint presentation for a whole chapter of the novel. Just remember that you can use any sort of textual information to sub in when your narrator, for some reason, isn't the best person to communicate that part of the story. I really like this next point. I think it's probably my favorite in this whole video. It is number 4, the indirect approach to character building. Juan Rulfo is from Mexico, and yes, I live in California and can't roll my R's. Please don't shoot me. He is the author of the novel Pedro Paramo. Now, normally when you're thinking about how to introduce a main character in your story, say a hero or a villain, you know, if they're a hero, you have them save the cat. If they're a villain, you have them kick a puppy, and we know right away, like, oh, that's the type of person this is. What I like about what Rulfo does in Pedro Paramo is that he takes a much more indirect approach. So we don't initially see the villain in this book in an actual scene. We hear about them secondhand. Someone is telling us about this character. And I really like this approach because it sort of like builds up and builds their legend before we actually see the character firsthand in a scene. In this story, the son is returning to his father's town. His father is Pedro Paramo, and he meets someone on the road who tells him 3 things: that this place is hell, that his father, Pedro, has fathered hundreds of children in this village, and 3, he tells him that his father is, quote, living bile. So as readers, our curiosity is whetted. We're like, whoa, who is this guy? And then the rest of the novel gives us scenes with this guy, starting as a child when he's good, and then escalating all the way to the horrible crimes he commits as the premier villain of the novel. This next thing that we can learn from South American authors is very clever. It is number 5, the Contrapuntal Effect. This insight comes from Mario Vargas Llosa, who was a native of Peru. He also died last month, I'm sorry to say, so God rest his soul. Now, contrapuntal is a musical term just talking about multiple individual lines of music and how they're all woven together. And I think this is a very useful term to think about having multiple points of view. In Llosa's interview with the Paris Review, he says that there are a whole bunch of obvious benefits to having multiple narrators in your story. And he specifically points out 2 benefits. The first one is, he says that having multiple narrators gives a certain air of ambiguity. His most famous novel is The War of the End of the World, which tells about this 19th century war in Canudos, which is in Brazil. And he tells this story from the perspective of a ton of different people, from the rebels, from the journalists, from the citizens. And what this does to you as a reader is it makes you not sure of which stories are true, because sometimes the stories contradict with each other. You're like, do I trust the rebels story, or do I trust the journalist story, or do I trust the citizen story? The second thing that Llosa said was great about having multiple points of view is it gives your story a lot more depth. And for an example of this, let's look at the 1950s Japanese film Rashomon. In this movie, 4 different people give an account of this man's murder and the rape of his wife. And every single one gives more complexity and layers to the story. If we had only gotten the story from one of their points of view, it would have been fairly simplistic. But as more and more perspectives are added, you realize that this story has a lot more depth I initially would have thought. Now, if you try this in your novel, there are 2 things that you have to remember. And Llosa does both of these in his book. Your multiple points of view should both complement each other and contrast each other. In War of the End of the Worlds, a lot of these stories complement each other. Both the rebels and the government have a kind of political idealism. But do not forget that you also have to contrast the stories and find different insights and different approaches to how different people tell these stories. In War of the End of the World, you see all these different social classes, and so they have very different perspectives on what this war means and what they want the outcome of this war to be. Now, this next tip is an intriguing one. You might feel a little bit confused by it at the beginning, but hold on, I'll explain it. It is number 6, use words as bait. This insight has been given to us by Clarice Lispector, who is from Brazil. Her most famous novel is probably The Hour of the Star. Now, I gotta warn you, she is definitely more of an experimental novelist, and we're going to go deep on this one. But you know, I don't think a lot of you watch this channel because you want to hear about like the new technique of show don't tell. I think that a lot of you watch because you're like, I got the basics down, and now I want to like graduate to the next level of understanding of fictional complexity and depth. That's what I'm trying to deliver here. So in her novel, Agua Vita, Lispector says, "The best is not yet written. The best is between the lines." I think what she's saying here is that the deepest and most profound parts of your story are not going to be found in the actual words of the story, but in what is unspoken, in what is implied, kind of in the subtext of your story. In some ways, this concept is similar to Hemingway's idea of the iceberg. Most of the story is below the waterline. It's unwritten. The author knows it, but they don't have to put it in the story. And then what's actually visible in the story is just the part above the water, a very small part. And this brings us back to what I titled this section, which was use words as bait. This is a phrase that Clarice Lispector has used to communicate this concept. She uses words as a way to fish for deeper ideas. So the way that you should write your novel should bait the reader into a deeper understanding of life, of people, and of existence. All right, so now let's get to our final piece of advice from South American writers. Number 7, the counterintuitive symbol. This insight is also from Clarice Lispector, and we're looking at her novel, The Passion According to G.H. So you're gonna laugh at the description of this novel. It is absolutely wild. It is the story of a woman who finds a cockroach, kills it, and then proceeds to question her life in this whole mystical and philosophical experience, and then eats the cockroach. I know, it's gross, it's disgusting, and that's kind of the point. Because she has taken this object of universal disgust, nobody likes cockroaches, which Kafka used to turn into a metaphor for like alienation. And instead she takes it and uses it as a metaphor, almost like a sacramental metaphor for how she gains insight into life. So I want you to look at all the symbols in your fiction, and I want you to ask yourself, is this what I call a ready-made symbol? Like, of course that symbol represents this. That's like obvious. Or is it, like Clarice Lispector, more of a counterintuitive symbol? Quick examples of both of those. A ready-made symbol would be like a broken mirror symbolizing a fractured identity. Like in Spider-Man 2, when Norman Osborn is turning into the Green Goblin, and he looks into this broken mirror, and it's representative of his divided self. Another ready-made example would be glasses on a character, which automatically represents intelligence or nerdiness. And then when a character removes them, suddenly they're like beautiful, and it's like this whole makeover. Primo example of that would be The Princess Diaries. So in contrast to that is The Stranger, where the sun, and you normally think of the sun as being very healing and positive, ends up causing a man to commit murder. The sun is oppressive and hostile and directly linked to violence and death. Or look at the pearl in John Steinbeck's The Pearl. What should represent wealth and good fortune and blessing ends up being a curse that brings a ton of destruction onto their family. So lastly, I just want to confess to a horrible crime. I have done an entire video about South American authors, and I didn't even mention Jorge Luis Borges. I am sorry. Yes, I have read a lot of Borges. I just didn't come up with a specific lesson that I could use for this video. If you have learned something from reading Borges, please list in the comments what you think you have learned as a writer from reading him. And please check out the description to see the links that I have there to help writers from editing to publicity to Bookfox Academy, and happy writing.